Hi, my name is Claire Corbett. I'm an Canadian-Australian writer. My second novel, Watch Over Me, has just been published by Allen and Unwin. And I suppose it's a little unusual because it's not set in Australia, it's set in Northern Europe, and that choice was dictated by looking at the history of warfare in the West, and I wanted to write something very modern, and I started writing it before things were heating up in Ukraine, because I started writing it in 2013. But I was thinking about the history of like the Balkans War and World War II, and I thought, well, there are strategic reasons, but I really wanted to talk about the history of war and how it affects people now. So it's got these layers of both historical meaning, right back to the Iliad, but also World War II and also the Balkans, and as I say now, what's happening in Ukraine, which came along after I started writing the book, or at least my awareness of it did. So I felt it was plausible and that there are real strategic reasons. But what I was really interested in, it's a very personal story. It's very much bringing it down to the level of the effect on civilians. So I have a young woman, Sylvie is my main character. She's only 19, and she's put in the situation that women are put in under occupation, where she has to try and keep herself safe. She has to try and keep her family safe. And she does that as best she knows how. But she meets one of the occupying soldiers, and for various reasons they have a relationship, and that puts her in a very difficult position because her older brother is part of the resistance, so she can't be faithful to everybody in her life. You know, whatever she does, she's going to betray someone, and I do think civilians are put in that position. It's impossible to keep everybody safe and to do the right thing. There is no one right thing. And I particularly wanted to focus on what happens to civilians, and that's why I made it Europeans in Europe, because it's been a long time since people in the West have been subjected to that. We're really good at doing it to other people and to thinking of them as other, and it's like, okay, let's get back to what happens if it's done in the middle of Europe or at the top of Europe. And I did a lot of research, and I had a lot of veterans and serving soldiers and people who'd left the military who gave me very specific advice when I had questions for them, because I'd been working on writing about these matters. And I feel very strongly that there aren't enough people doing this. So in the West, we hear a lot from soldiers, because we're very disconnected from our military. We don't want to know, we're not interested. So in Australia, and I should have said this actually in the talk downstairs, Australian soldiers were in Afghanistan as long as the Greek soldiers camped on the plains of Troy, and yet not a single Australian writer has dealt with that. It doesn't seem to be interested. And I would go to these strategy conferences. They're not very difficult to get into. You could just get a journalist pass from a magazine. I would write articles about them. And I don't see any other fiction writers. I don't see any women, and I think men need to shut up about war. It's, you know, I'm sick of it being their subject, and that we need to hear from women, because it's actually women and children who suffer the most. I'm kind of sick of hearing about the suffering of soldiers. Even though I'm sympathetic, they choose. In the West, people choose to go into the military. They're not being conscripted in most, they're not being conscripted in the US, they're not being conscripted in Canada, they're not being conscripted in the UK or in Australia. So I wanted to bring that focus back to the victims of war. So that's what that book is about, but it's a very intense, very emotional book, because there aren't easy answers, and I very deliberately made it that you can't assign a good side and a bad side, because it's really not that easy anymore. There might be bad and worse, possibly, but there isn't much virtue around, and so I really didn't name the countries that were involved for that reason.
Okay.